Welcome, everybody. This evening, we don't have a whole heck of a lot on our agenda outside of the panel cost and funding options. So we are going to get started. So I will work from my left side, starting with Chris Campney. Introduction of the panelists, please.
Chris Campney, Wyndham Regional Commission.
Laura Sibilia, representative from the House Energy and Technology Committee.
Sarah Coffey, I'm a representative for Wyndham 1, Vernon and Guilford, but I'm here as a citizen appointee by the Speaker of the House.
Emily Davis, citizen appointee by Senator Pro Tem Timash.
Bob Leach, appointed by the Governor.
Josh Unruh, Chair, appointed by the Governor.
Madeline Arms, Town of Vernon.
June Tierney, Commissioner, Department of Public Service.
Bill Irwin, representing the Agency of Human Services. I work for the Vermont Department of Health.
Corey Daniels with North Star.
David Pearson, North Star.
And we have two people on the phone.
I'll go first. Bob Gustafson, State of New Hampshire, appointed by the Governor to represent the 6 communities in New Hampshire that were part of the EPZ.
Second person on the phone. Let's hear from you. Who is it?
It's Commissioner Emily Boddicker.
Tony, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, excellent. Emily Boddicker, Commissioner, Department of Environmental Conservation.
Okay. Let's take a review and entertain the motion to approve the minutes from January 2020.
Mr. Chair, just as it was a snafu, but we do not have printouts of the meeting minutes this evening. They are available online. I don't know if anyone has had opportunity to review them.
Seeing that there's nobody jumping at the chance to review and approve January 2020, maybe we will move those to the next meeting for approval. Is the panel happy with that?
I think it's fine.
Okay, great. So we will begin our discussion on panel operating cost and potential funding options. I will open up the floor to Representative Sibilia and Coffey, as they have an option for us in this respect, and then I will turn it over to Commissioner Tierney to give her option as well.
Okay, thank you. So I think all of the members received, and I think it's posted, a letter talking about what Representative Coffey and I have done, as well as a draft discussion proposal for some potential funding. I think pretty simply, we went out to gather more information about what was possible, what informed opinions might consider as possible. We did speak with North Star. We also spoke with members from the Institute for Nuclear Host Communities, which is an organization that started out of this region and thinks about local and regional impacts. And in doing that, we put together, gleaning from what we've heard from the handicap committee, some possible, and North Star, some possible activities that might be helpful to the panel. Those would include looking at having a dedicated communications staffer, so having the panel having the ability to communicate through press releases, etc. Some dedicated support, administrative support for the panel. as well as we have heard notion of the cost associated for citizen participants, so a slight increase in a per diem. We put that down for possible consideration, as well as some estimated costs. I think the commissioner, when she is able to review her costs, can update equipment needs costs. We did not anticipate, given the late status of where we are in this process with decommissioning, the need to bring additional experts here. I think that might have been instructive earlier on in the process, and it may in fact be something that other communities may want to consider. But at this point, it doesn't really seem that that's necessarily helpful. Folks that could help us, that have experience, probably can participate via phone, I would think, at this point. I think we have put together something that would envision it going as long as NDCAP is engaged in the process of decommissioning of the plant. And in our discussions, it seems that the current statute would already allows for the possible participation of North Star. I will tell you that the legislature has attorneys that can review different materials, and we do have a legislative attorney that is reviewing the possibilities here, but I hope folks will take our documents as a place to add some information and some knowledge from outside experts into how we might improve this process. We're happy for them to contribute to a better conversation and maybe a productive conversation this evening. And now I will let Representative Coffey very much approve what I've said.
I mean, I think everybody understands, but for the public, you might know, that understands the context for this funding proposal. It came from whether we needed to change language in statute. And just to give back up a step, is that in putting forward the changes to the statute regarding the composition of this panel, which had been the primary changes that the panel had recommended, the question came up about how do we fund this activity, and it's been a question that's come up because currently the Department of Public Service bears those costs, and so that's where this is coming from, and it's by no means seen as an end run around this panel process. It's just that we happen to be in the State House, and folks, some of the folks who work with North Star suggested that there might be a way to bring in funding that did not require a change to the statute. So really, we're bringing this here as we hope as a starting point for us to have a productive conversation about how to do it. So I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts, and also from the commissioner.
Yeah. And I would add one more thing, if I may. So at the last meeting, we heard an idea about possibly just a straight up shift in financial accountability in the regulation from the department to North Star. And that, folks may recall, that felt a little like, wow, that seems like a pretty tall mountain to climb in terms of legislation. And that really was my motivation in terms of understanding what we could do in this legislative session, what was possible, readily possible. I think we certainly could change the language. I think that will be involved, and I think this panel will need to be pretty sure about what it is that they're trying to accomplish, and how it is that they plan to engage in that process.
So I'm going to open it up to the panel and specifically to Commissioner Tierney to make comments regarding the proposal that was brought forth by Representative Civilian Coffee, and how it varies from, you know, what you're looking at and how it would work within your department.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question to the panelists first. Do folks have a copy of the document that I provided online that summarizes costs? So folks do have that for discussion purposes tonight. I thought it might be useful to provide a little walkthrough of this, much as Representative Civilian, Representative Coffey just did, of the documents that they have put before us. I would begin first by thanking Representative Civilian and Representative Coffey for the efforts they've made in coming up with the information that they've provided. I find the $35,000 figure that you've identified instructive, and it's precisely that kind of spade work that this panel has been needing to do for some time in order to have a frank conversation about expectations as to what can and cannot be done realistically in the framework of this panel. I note Representative Sebelia's comment about the need for experts, and I think that too is instructive. That goes to the heart of the matter that has prompted my concern. I am very eager to hear from other panelists as to what their views are in terms of anticipating future needs, because it's that prospective need that has driven my concern about amending the statute if we're going to go forward with that kind of work using experts and the like. It is certainly a topic that's come up in the past on this panel, though earlier in my tenure, which I think predates a couple of the panel members we have here today, I started this work in January of 2017, and I should also note that at that time, my agency was running a deficit and had been running a deficit for a while. And this is something that I was only able to straighten out last legislative session, so that this year, for the first time, I actually have enough funding to pay for my agency's operations. That's huge, because as you can see from the document I've provided to you, the costs that the agency's been bearing over and above what I call the Section 1 costs are considerable. And I have had to think for some period of time now hard about what realistically that can come out of the department's budget in order to underwrite the activities of NDCAP. So turning to the document I provided to you, at the top on page 1 you see Section 1, and those are the nuts and bolts logistical costs of our meetings, things like the room that we're in tonight, the videography that we have, the notes that get produced afterwards, and the like. Those costs are not substantial in isolation, but I would just point out that in the year that I took over, they appear to have peaked at $11,000, and that followed several years of going upward. That cost curve was bent down a little bit thereafter, and then significantly in 2019, and this reflects the fact that the panel started meeting less frequently at that point, and so the costs came down. That will continue, I would expect, and so I think it's fair to say that the cost figure from 2019 is probably representative, just on the nuts and bolts. If you drop down to Section 2, this is the time cost of my agency devoted to NDCAP activities, and I might say that this is distinct from the other agencies in that under the existing statute for supporting NDCAP, it is the department that is assigned primary responsibility for doing all of the activities that the work of Representative Civilian, Representative Coffey would shift to an individual who is dedicated as a communications staffer under the control of NDCAP chair. So that's I would just highlight that most of the activities that have been identified in the what I'm going to call discussion draft proposal from we'll just leave it at that, the discussion draft proposal that Representative Civilian, Representative Coffey walked us through, those functions, while they may be reasonable and prudent for the panel to have the benefit of, right now by statute, those are all things that my agency is required to provide for the panel. So right there, you're looking at a statutory change if we're going to have somebody else do that, in my opinion. And I do not believe this is something that can be altered by MOU. In any case, as you can see looking at my document, the costs in my agency of providing support for handicap have been substantial. Just to give you some context, in the fall of 2018, I had to conduct a reduction in force where I had to release 5 positions in my agency. That $43,000 would have come in handy, or the $61,000 of time equivalency would have come in handy that we incurred for 2019. So this is not an inconsiderable issue for the department. Turning to Section 3, this is just to give you some insight into what preparation and attendance at these meetings alone costs. It comes to something like $14,000 for a year. These are costs that the agencies do not bill back to North Star, just as I do not bill back the Section 2 costs to North Star as well. In my judgment, reading the statute, I do not have the authority to bill back such costs right now to North Star, which is one of the reasons why I'm so keen to at least recover the logistical costs from Section 1 from North Star, as well as to clarify that the company would be responsible for any other costs that are incurred under Section 1700, I think it's A6G, meaning the experts and the contracting for services and the like. So on the bottom of page 2, you see just a snapshot of what the cost of handicap was in 2019. In my judgment, the $4,000 is something that North Star definitely should have been paying. I think there's a case to be made for the $61,000 in time costs that my agency spent, but I also think that there's a case to be made that that ought not necessarily to be billed back to North Star absent a different statutory change. And the $14,000, I think there's an argument to be made for that being billed back to North Star as well, but that's not driving my concern at this point. What really drives my concern, to repeat myself, is if this panel is to make use of the option that is reserved to it under 18 VSA 17 G6. This is on page 3. It's the middle statutory provision where I've underscored the language. In that section 6, it says hire experts, contract for services, provide materials and other reasonable necessary expenses of the panel. To be candid, and this is why I wanted to have the conversation with the panel, in my time as commissioner, this issue has not been forced because we've been preoccupied with reorganization, adapting to a new chair, trying to figure out what our issues would be. The settlement with North Star that resulted in the decommissioning process starting sooner than anybody expected was a real game changer. So this issue of where is this panel going and what resources does it need to get there has sort of been dormant under the surface. But we're there now because we're looking at amending the statute. As I have said at prior meetings, when you open a can of worms, which is what statutory amendment is, you are well served by getting it all done at once and not doing it piecemeal. And that is the spirit in which I came to this panel and said we need to have this conversation about expenses, which I've been trying to have for quite some time now. And I thank the panel for its patience and its willingness to convene tonight's meeting. I will also say that the process we've been through and the conversations that we've had have informed my thinking. I really do go back to Montpelier and reflect on what I hear here. It is never a meeting that I get over and then just go home and forget about, because I'm the commissioner of everybody, which is also the commissioner of this panel and the public that we serve. And it's incumbent on me to reflect on the things that I hear, so that while I respectfully have to disagree with the proposition that an MOU could be prepared that would allow Entergy to pay a certain amount that is fixed, in order to pay for these costs that I'm concerned about, I can recognize that there's a limit as to what can be achieved in any one legislative session. So I have heard what our legislative colleagues are saying about what realistically can be achieved. And from my own view, I have looked at the existing statute, and I have language that would amend the statute to the satisfaction of the Commissioner of the Department of Public Service, but I don't know that that would necessarily be to the satisfaction of this panel. And I'm happy to share that language with anyone who'd like to see it. But in a nutshell, what it says is North Star will bear the costs under 6G, and North Star will have an option of seeking review of the reasonableness of those costs from the PUC. And in the first instance, it would remain the Commissioner of the Department of Public Service who determines whether those costs are reasonable in the first case. So I do not see that as a complicated statutory amendment, but I do appreciate that I don't sit under the Golden Dome day in, day out, and I especially do not sit on House Energy Technology, so I must defer to Representative Sebilia's judgment as to what the likelihood of success is in seeking an amendment of that kind. I do give you this notice, if you will. If I have to accept that we will not be amending the statute on this particular issue this year, notwithstanding the panel's vote last time around that we did want to shift costs to North Star, it is very likely that the department will seek this amendment in its own right next year with the proper timing, because it is, in my judgment, a matter that needs to be addressed in this fashion. Turning to the materials that Representative Coffey and Sebilia have provided, the reasons why I don't think the MOU route would work are as follows. Looking at the existing statute, I don't see any authority for NDCAP to be entering into contracts or directing actions that would result in an MOU. NDCAP has an advisory mission. The ability to contract or to otherwise make arrangements for logistical support is vested in my office. And I take that to mean is that I would have to be the one who acceded to an MOU. As you well understand, I have a regulatory supervisory relationship with North Star. It is a relationship that seeks a constructive dynamic, and I should hasten to add that in my judgment, the company has been a good faith partner in what it's doing here as a decommissioning company. But if things go wrong or if discipline is necessary, that originates in the first instance in my office. And so to put me in the position, or to put my successors in the position of also being a counterparty to a freely entered into MOU, in my judgment, is not tenable. And even if it were something that I was inclined to do, I have serious reservations about entering into an MOU or a contract that effectively displaces statutory responsibilities as presently enumerated for my office. In other words, I question whether I could enter into a contract that hires an individual to do things that the statute says my office is supposed to do. Footnote there, I would take from the proposal the suggestion that perhaps there are things that my office needs to improve by way of the services that it's providing to NDCAP. And that's certainly a conversation I'm willing to have with anyone at any time. But I do not think the solution realistically is to contract for them elsewhere. The language about there being the ability to enter into such an MOU because the statute provides that the funds for our activities shall come from the department's funds and quote, such other sources as may be or become available. In my judgment, it is not in scope such that it would permit the MOU contemplated here. I read that language to mean that if the NRC were to approve decommissioning funding, for which you've heard me advocate, or if the legislature were to make an appropriation to support NDCAP, that those would be things that would be encompassed by that language. But an MOU for which I lack the authority to sign up, I do not feel falls within that scope. I think I've covered all my points. And I think I'll close my comments at this juncture by saying that I am prepared to accept that I am not going to be able to effect the change that I would like to see in this legislative session. But I underscore that that is not uniquely my decision. Tonight's conversation is about what this panel would like to see its future be, and for me to get guidance on that point. And now I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chair.
So, go ahead, Chris.
I have a question for the commissioner. The cost increase under staff hours for 2019, can you shed some light on that? I don't doubt that happened. I didn't know like to what extent that reflected staff doing the work that the previous chairs had done, or what?
That's exactly what it is.
Wow.
I think what you're seeing there is, for folks who were not on the panel at the time, you did not have the pleasure of working with Kate O'Connor, but Kate was a real dynamo, and we learned at the end of her tenure just how much she had been doing in her capacity as chair. And I think for those of us who are still on the panel, it was a real revelation to understand not only that she had been carrying so much administrative and frankly expense for the panel, but also we understood that this was not an acceptable thing to continue to expect from a chair. And Chris, you'll recall your tenure was vastly different in nature as a result, and I think for Mr. Unruh it would be the same. But that's what that jump represents.
It was actually a condition of my chairing the.
Indeed it was.
The only other thing I'll observe, and I'm not disagreeing with the numbers at all.
Not at all.
I mean, because that's important to note how much the volunteer hours were contributing to the support of the panel. But in the earlier years, and Tony and Bill and the others who were here earlier on, when the commissioner was chair, did we not start doing reports until Kate was chair?
I'm sorry, Chris. These are things that I wouldn't know anything about.
Well, I was just looking at the numbers. Again, I'm trying to think about I'm thinking about the cost of what it actually takes to support the panel. And what I was trying to remember was in the first years, I know the statute said we had to prepare a report. I'm not remembering if we did exactly or not, or who prepared it, if it was Tony or Chris or somebody else in your all's office. But of course, Kate was very heavily involved in not only setting the agendas, but even recruiting who was coming to speak. So I'm sure that took some time away from Tony. It's just, I almost feel like we should send another letter or something to Kate saying thank you. But I was just trying to think about those earlier years, because we had a lot of meetings in those earlier years, and there was a lot of work to be done. But did that still primarily fall to Kate once she was chair?
Right, two issues on that point. One, it's entirely possible that the answer to that is yes, Kate did a lot of that. I wouldn't want to discount that. It is also possible that the records from that time are not as robust as they are now.
Yeah.
I can only, with perfect confidence, speak to the records that date to my tenure.
Okay. Commissioner, I can shed some light on that if it would help. To answer, okay, first the specific question on the annual reports. The history on it, the first annual report, there was one done for 2014. The department subcontracted that out. If you remember, we had the Consensus Building Institute on contract for several items, and one of them was to finish the 2014 report. 2015, 2016 annual reports, Chairman O'Connor basically said, Tony, don't worry about them, I'll get them done. I didn't realize that meant that she was going to be doing them personally, but what I had expected was that there was going to be a small committee of panelists who would actually work on it, but she was doing that herself. The 2017 report, actually, for those of you who remember David Andrews, I know he pulled a lot of that together. And then 2018 and 2019 was, well, okay, 2018 you provided feedback on what you wanted as panel chair, and 2019 I pretty much ran with it on my own, offering an outline to the panel. Some of the other volunteerism, listening to Commissioner Tierney, I realized that very early on there was a discussion between the previous commissioner, Commissioner Recchia, and several senior Entergy staff to provide what was called in-kind administrative support. So for a while there, Entergy provided a note taker. It was someone from Entergy staff who took notes and was the primary generator of meeting minutes. But then when that person moved on from Entergy, there was no replacement for that. So that became a cost that the Public Service Department wound up picking up because, well, we needed someone and we needed a low-budget staff person for that. So a lot of it was the prior, Chair O'Connor, but there were some other here and there's of, at one point, Entergy covered some costs, at some point, the department covered costs, and where the costs have been covered has moved around a little bit in the history of the panel.
I'll just wrap up. I think, just for the panel, I was just trying to offer some, or think through the history of how we function in our expenditures. So I would imagine that even though 2019 looks a bit like an anomaly, it's probably reflective of what it actually costs to operate the panel when you're just having quarterly meetings, and frankly, not really taking on that, not doing a very heavy lift. So we're, from a budgeting standpoint or a time standpoint, however that translates into hours and effort, that's probably reflective of what it actually takes.
So let me throw my 2 cents in because I'm really good at that. I think for us tonight, it's, if we decide to, I think it's a determination of a dollar amount, not necessarily how that dollar amount is spent. Representative Sebelian and Coffey have laid out a fairly good plan of how those dollars that they propose could be spent, and the ways that they can be most effectively used. But I think for us as a panel, we need to determine a dollar figure of what it takes to run this panel, because as we transition over the next several years, those particular positions that are laid out in Representative Sebelian and Coffey's proposal may change. The needs may change as we go through the decommissioning process. So I think a dollar figure is more important than necessarily how it's spent. That's my opinion, and I'm open to hear different opinions on that. I'm okay with the dollar figure that was set forth by Representative Sebelian and Coffey to help us to function appropriately, but I don't want to pigeonhole us into a specific way to spend those dollars. So I'm open to discussion on what we've heard thus far, and anybody's got an opinion outside of what I just said.
So I actually appreciated Chris's summary there, that the 2019 expenses as described at the bottom of page 2 of the Commissioner's prepared document is probably more likely the actual costs, as opposed to those costs that are itemized on the document from our representatives. Given the ease at which it is possible to actually review and account for those costs in state government. So I would feel that we may be underestimating what it would require to sponsor 4 meetings a year if we were to stay with the 35,000 as represented in our representative's proposal. And I think it would be better to probably work towards the higher figure, which is approaching $80,000, as represented in Commissioner Tierney's document.
I know we're all sitting here contemplating everything that's going on. Representative Sabia, you got something to say?
Well, I think I would most like to hear from other panelists if they have thoughts first. So I can wait.
Tony, this is Emily Bodecker, if I could jump in with a question.
Yes, please.
So as I was looking at this, there's 3 things that I'm primarily evaluating. One is I think we need a permanent solution, a long-term solution, rather than trying to do something for an interim. So I'm interested in understanding how we can get to a permanent solution. And one hopes that we will continue to have good relationships with all parties involved, but money can get tricky at times. So I think a permanent solution, and by that one, which is, solid in law, is important. Who authorizes the costs for the panel, I think is really important. And so I too appreciated seeing what the panel actually costs, and would also be interested from some of the longer term panel members if some of the assertions about this being the right grouping of costs, that we wouldn't be looking for additional experts and things going forward. I'd just like to make sure that we have a good consensus from the panel for that. And so in terms of how we proceed from here, I would also like to revisit the question, I'm not quite where Commissioner Tierney is, about ruling out a change this legislative session. I appreciate that there's a lot on the docket. There's some very big bills that the House Energy and Technology Committee has. But if there is a very simple change, the few lines that Commissioner Tierney had identified, I also don't want to rule out that possibility of potentially taking this to the legislator, getting clear language in the statute, and having this resolved so we can focus back then on the core work of the panel. So if anybody has any comments and thoughts on any of the statements I just made, I'd be very appreciate hearing them.
May I just have one thought that I would like to just make sure I am absolutely perfectly clear on. So this panel can move forward with recommendations for statutory changes this year? Absolutely. Some of the, you have heard me put forward some cautions, which are intended to reflect just the reality of the situation on the ground. But if there's consensus on this panel that they want to move forward with changes in legislation this year, they should do so. I have made cautions about making sure that it is clear what the panel wants, that there is a clear plan for supporting those changes in the legislature by the panel. And so that's it. I just want to make sure that it's understood. If the panel wants to move this forward, they should. I feel like I've tried to be responsible in letting folks know, here's kind of the situation on the ground. Representative Coffey and I have been cautioning folks for the last 2 or 3 meetings about the timeframes involved in this second year of a biennium. To the greatest extent possible, just to help inform and allow this committee, this panel, to have as much flexibility as possible. So,
And so I wanted to say two things. One is also, if, I agree, the committee is going to be taking this up. It does mean that it gets negotiated in that committee and in a money committee. And that the recommendations from this panel are not the only recommendations that might come to that committee. There can be other folks who might want to weigh in on that. But I think what I'd hope that we could figure out tonight is what are we really hoping for the support of this panel, and how can we get there? Because, I think I've heard a lot of different, this is really just throwing something, it doesn't need to be necessary. These recommendations that we have, this is a brainstorm really about, these are the kinds of things. So I think I'd like to start, how does this panel want to work and operate? What are we doing well? What's missing? What are other, we've done a little, like the beginning of research. We got a letter from Ray Shaddis here about what they're doing in Maine. I really think because we're one of the states that's in the early wave of decommissioning these plants, and we have an opportunity. I mean, folks are going to be looking to this process as a model. So, and is it the best use of, our nuclear engineers' time to be setting up tables for a panel? I'm not sure if I, as a taxpayer, see that that's the best use of somebody's time. So could we kind of get into this a little bit? Since this is our main piece of business tonight, it would be great to have a sense of the panel. What is it that we need? How much do we think it might cost? Build in some flexibility. And then whether the solution is whether we do it in statute or whether there's a creative way to do it. I think there's a willingness from North Star to pay for some of these costs. I don't really think that is the question. I think it's about how we get there. So I really would love to hear from other folks and other folks who have been, I've been on the panel since September of 2019. So I want to hear from other folks what they think that we're missing. I mean, because I think we've heard from the public that the meetings are not very well advertised, beyond what the Department of Public Service can do on its website, and whether it's that we need somebody like a communications staffer or a part-time person or a very part-time person to get the word out on the meetings. Because I think it's really important that people know about these meetings and that there's participation from the public.
See, I would, personally, I would challenge that particular line of thinking, because when this panel started, especially through the sale process, the meetings have been always worn the same way. And we've had several people throughout the sale process attend these meetings. Our meetings were full. We had 30 speakers, times coming up and, voicing their concerns to the panel. And we haven't changed the way we warn the meetings in the time, like as far as the time length that, they get warned out and that kind of thing. As far as I'm aware, I don't think it's necessarily an issue of how the meetings are being marketed or put out to the public. I think it's just a lack of interest from the public to attend the meetings at this point, since the sale has gone through. That's my personal opinion on it, just basically from seeing where we started to where we are now, and the lack of public participation from the beginning of the sale process till now. And it doesn't mean that anybody's any more interested or not interested in what's going on at the site. It just means that less people are participating in the actual handicap meetings themselves.
May I say something? My comment is coming based on what people have come in and said here. It's not based on my opinion. So about participation, but I think going back to it, it's like, is this what we currently have in this budget that the commissioner has put together? Is this sufficient to do what we need to do? the work that needs to be done? Or do we want to be, I've heard, I mean, there are a few people who are not here tonight who have advocated for having folks come and participate in this meeting, or for, as participating in national conferences. I mean, there's been a wide range of ideas, and we haven't been able to get to those ideas because there hasn't been the funding there. So that, I would rather have us have a conversation about that part of it for what we want to do.
So I would add, I think the vice chair has often spoke to the need to have potentially additional experts, et cetera. I know this probably is not official. I'm certain that it is not official, and certainly she cannot vote. But Representative Coffey and I and the chair did receive, and Tony, did receive an email from her at 4:30 this evening thanking us for putting together the draft discussion proposal, and noted that it seems reasonable.
Mr. Chair?
Going to go to Chris, and then we'll come back.
So I'll just start with just what I think would be useful from as far as from a panel perspective, and this is regardless of anybody's proposals or anything. We basically have a roadmap forward about how the decommissioning and site restoration are going to occur, and we have reporting requirements in the board order that says what North Star and the state have to do at a minimum, and that all ties back to the March report, as I recall, to the state, and then or that I think the state is supposed to then provide like a report to the public, and what I was thinking when being involved in that docket around the sale was that a useful role for IndyCap would be looking at that schedule. And let me just tell for the panel members and the public who don't also know, if something goes wrong on the site, if North Star discovers something that wasn't expected that affects the timing of the decommissioning or the cost, they have to notify the state within 7 days. But I'm just talking about just the regular schedule. My thinking had been that a good structure would be plan a big, whatever, I don't know exactly what this means, but the big kind of annual meeting of IndyCap for like May or so, after the report's been in, after the state agencies had the chance to do some analysis, after North Star's had some time to kind of process what it all means. And so then we have like the big, I would say kind of the spring big annual IndyCap meeting. And then the meetings that would follow on after that are kind of check-ins to see how things are going with the regulatory agencies, with North Star itself, and if North Star's hear from the town of Vernon how they think things are going, but that we would kind of organize ourselves around that initial reporting of data, that kind of annual check-in. And then, of course, we would also, if something did happen and that you trigger that 7-day notification and something material has changed that's going to potentially affect the cost and schedule, then of course we would want to have another meeting. And so I was thinking that the real function of IndyCap is to take that information, present it as fully as possible to the public, allow the public to comment on the information that's presented, and then that after that spring meeting that could also inform other topics that we take up during those other meetings that we have. As for cost, I just have it seems to me that the costs of regulation shouldn't be externalized, and North Star should bear those costs. And as far as who ultimately does the work, as far as like whether it's a state nuclear engineer or if it's, Tony actually, doing his job as a nuclear engineer, and then other consultants are hired to provide support work that maybe they're less expensive than state employees, maybe they're not. That seems like another analysis that we could do. You could have other supporting staff or supporting consultants to do the logistical work and other things that maybe Tony doesn't need to be doing. But that was the kind of structure that just for me personally, I had envisioned. Now, how we get there, what we need to change in statute, I've got some ideas, I think, but that could have some effect. You know, I appreciate the proposals that the legislators brought forth to us. I appreciate also the position that the commissioner mentioned about the state budget. But as far as just like the actual function of handicap and its purpose that it serves, those were kind of my notions, and so I just wanted to throw that out there for what it's worth for people to respond to. I'm not claiming that I'm right. It's just that's an idea that I've had.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. I thought what Chris just outlined right now is one very measured and clearly identified path for handicap to define the scope of its work at this time. And I think one of the things that's particularly appealing about it is that it meets the concerns that, or better said, the point that Representative Sibilia has made more than once about the need to ensure that a spotlight stays trained on the events through decommissioning, the progress of the company through decommissioning, so that the public has a genuine window into this. What I would add to Chris's description is this. It's one thing for this panel to lay bare or to make clear in a public forum what the current status is of decommissioning under the board order and the reporting events. It's another thing to provide a place for the public, having digested those events, to come back and to tell us what its concerns are. That too is a part of handicap. And it may well be that through those comments from the public, the panel develops questions or concerns that we can't sit here tonight and anticipate. Some of those concerns might, for all I know, best be informed by the assessment of an expert who could help this panel decide what advice it ought to give to the governor or to state agencies about whatever the particular concern is that has arisen. What has troubled me to date in my tenure has been the prospect that a decision about whether to retain such an expert would turn on whether I have money available in my agency. That to me is a very unfortunate confluence of events, and that's exactly where we have been for the last several years. And to my mind, it's a statutory change that removes that unfortunate nexus so that this panel, should the need arise, is in a position to avail itself of its ability to get expert assistance as needed. Turning to the particulars about who sets up tables and the like, I don't especially like seeing my nuclear engineer employed in this fashion, but those are the resources available to my department, and those are the duties prescribed under the statute. And so unless a change is made, I have to make do with those resources, and it makes even less sense. Mr. Lashinsky actually lives in Connecticut and is down here. It might be less costly, I suppose, to dispatch somebody from my agency who doesn't have the same hourly rate, but I have to figure out who that person is and what work I'm going to remove from that person in order to send them down here in advance of meetings. I suppose another possibility would be to turn to North Star to say, North Star, under 1702, I hereby exercise my authority to have you assist the panel by taking over those logistical arrangements. Those are possibilities as well. But it seems to me that it's the larger picture I've been concerned about, which is how to make sure that this panel is not starved of resources because a state budget is constrained. And to that end, I think a statutory change is needed.
Actually, make sure that panel member there gets his chance to speak.
Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly.
I have, well, first off, I want to thank our representatives for preparing this discussion draft proposal. Getting the conversation queued up, it's helpful. I've been quiet over here just because I'm struggling with how much that I don't really know about really what the public needs. I don't know that there's a lot of consensus and agreement on this panel. And certainly that's just a reflection of myself, of what the public, whether or not folks in our community and the public have the same emotional reaction to this. I think that's, we can discuss that, but then also just more broadly and outside of, an emotional response to Vermont Yankee and to the decommissioning is what the public cares about. And I think that while it's true, there hasn't been the same awareness and attention to this project and to this whole situation, that might also just be because there isn't a strong vector of what's happening in these conversations into the community. And so that lack of awareness is a little bit self-perpetuating. I can see both. And so the root of that question and me not knowing what the public needs and what the public cares about here affects the whole question of what this should be and what should it become. It leads into, I think that the question is a good one, which is what advice we ought to give to the governor and what experts we might need to bring in to help inform not just this panel, but the community also matters, which is what the public needs and what's the best way for this panel to be a vector and a conduit to the public. So my instinct, like what I want to do is to know that. And yeah, there's my science training, which is like already designing the survey, the public survey in my head, which, to bring to the community. And I don't know if that might be, I know that that's an extra step. And I appreciate what our representatives and legislators had done to identify, while it's true that, we could at any point make statutory changes, and that might be required in the long run, but I also appreciate the move towards expediting a change that can still be helpful and supportive of this panel and our mission ultimately. And if it can be efficient and done quickly, that would be great. And so I don't want to pump the brakes and necessarily open this up if it doesn't need to be, but I don't know, right now I'm taking a big step back and really wondering at the root of it, what are the fundamental questions that this panel should be asking? And I'm continuing to draw some question marks. I just don't know enough.
And I may be wrong on this, others can weigh in, and Emily, I really appreciate your perspective on this, especially being new to it. Just having been in this discussion for a while now. Part of the context and this is why I was going back to what the board order says, the Public Utility Commission's already kind of weighed in on what North Star what they have to report on. And I would hope that North Star would be really interested in knowing what else the public would like to hear from them. And, and I think it's great, it would be a great idea for the panel, through a survey or through other means to find out what would the public like to know. But I think from a procedural standpoint, there's the Public Utility Commission has already weighed in on what has to be reported and when. And so I was trying to kind of propose from that bare bones approach, that we know that we've got an annual report that's going to be coming out, and it'd be, and an opportunity to gather that information from the public is based on what you're hearing. What else do you need to hear? What else do you want to hear? What else do you want us to bring to you? So that to me was kind of more of an expeditious approach to it, which may or may not make sense. But I think we are limited somewhat. Like even if we found out from the public everything that they wanted, what we can actually pry out may be somewhat limited. But again, North Star, hopefully they would stand up and go, yes, we would love to know more about what the public wants to know about our process and the transparency of our process and how the public would like us to communicate with them. But some of that's going to be voluntary on that their part, which is fine, because they should have the opportunity to weigh in about what they, how they view this whole process too. But I just wanted to kind of weigh in with that constraint. That's why we were, the panel was involved, and maybe not as robustly as would have been desired, but and coming up with an advisory position on what to even communicate to the Public Utility Commission about what needs to be communicated to the public. But that ship in some respects is kind of sailed, but we can always build another ship.
Well, to that point, Chris, I mean, North Star has, taken the steps to reach out in those respects through Mr. Hamilton, doing some community engagement with stakeholders to find out, what the communities are interested in, the community stakeholders are interested in. So I think those steps have been taken by North Star to this point, even above and beyond what the PUC has asked of them in that respect. I think they're resounding gong, and I hate to keep coming back to this, is that the public in general is, after the sale, is not terribly interested. I think there is a good sect that is interested in what's going on, at the plant, but they don't show up to our meetings. They're the silent majority. Let's just put it that way. They look from the background and, watch for our meeting minutes and that kind of thing and see what's going on. But they're not necessarily showing up to INDICAT meetings any longer. So I guess the emphasis for this panel is to be able to keep those type of people informed, because they're obviously not here. They haven't been attending for several meetings. They haven't been, expressing opinions and that kind of thing through our panel hearings. But they're there. And to be able to keep those folks informed is our job, whether they show up or not, to our panel hearings. And the question tonight is how do we effectively do that as a panel, and what resources do we need to be able to do that? Again, I'll state that, what Representative Sabine and Coffey have laid out seems to be effective in that manner. Seems to fit some of the bills of some of the questions that have been asked by the public that does attend. How do we more effectively communicate our meeting dates further out? How do we effectively communicate what we're going to be talking about, and how do we get the community involved in that respect? Because really, in the end, that's what our INDICAP is for. We are a conduit to the public that is interested in what's going on in the decommissioning, and even those that aren't interested in what's going on in the decommissioning, because at some point they could become interested and be able to look back and see the work that the panel's done and be able to come up to speed in that respect. I don't know that we're going to have an answer to our question tonight, but I will yield the floor to Mr. Irwin to listen to his comment.
So this is my 15th year of involvement with either the nuclear decommission, or I can't even remember what it was called before, the nuclear... VSNAP, Vermont State Nuclear Advisory Panel, thank you. And I can tell you that the things that are working now are obvious to me, and they are the results of the efforts of the Public Service Department. Specifically, the record keeping for this panel is exceptional. It is all open to the public. It is, while a government site, a place that you can go and find everything that has occurred under the NDCAP since its inception. Annual reports have been put together religiously, not always on time, but well-founded minutes records of votes, records of issues, records of presentations. The actual documents are there. I can also tell you that attendance at these meetings is typically measured by the contentiousness of the issues. That when, and frankly in VSNAP, there was always contentiousness. But since the negotiated settlement, the sale, and frankly the turnover from one owner to another, the transition from operating to decommissioning, I think there are a lot of settled issues. What will likely occur is that if there becomes a problem that causes costs to go up, or delays, or other concerns among the public, we'll see attendance rise again. And we need to be prepared for that. So I would suggest that, one, I think we really have a great system of record keeping that I would be concerned about throwing out because it's not broken. And I would appreciate instead that we continue to do what we're doing with the public service department's maintenance of the records of this panel and the availability of it. And I think the notices to the public of our meeting attendance, that they're occurring. I know we could do more. I don't know if there's anything that's happening in the local papers for notice that might be of use as well. Whether that's already occurring, I'm not sure. I appreciate your perspective, Chris, about a May meeting. I like that idea too, because I think there will be huge answers and questions in the March report. I know I can tell you as a state agency, I only have a timeline of work at Vermont Yankee that goes through December 2019 for the most part. And I'm anxious to know what 2020 has to observe as a state agency / regulator. And so I think there will be a lot to discuss then. And I do believe that the meetings in between those May kickoffs, if you want to call it that, are helpful to have each of the agencies and other stakeholders report on the status as we go from year to year. I do think that we are on a time table that has a certain end date, and that the sooner we act, the more likely we're going to benefit from a decision that we make. That if we wait another year for the next legislative session, we will be much further down this road that is rapidly moving. I can tell you, as someone who was at the site today, seeing what's occurred in just the last month, we are seeing rapid changes. We will see even more rapid changes in the coming months of 2020. There will be dramatic changes at that site, and we need to be able to accommodate those kinds of changes that might occur and interest that's likely to be generated in the public as they hear about these things. So I would, again, think of any sort of monetary figure or budget that might be associated with this to have some flexibility for where there were these kinds of dynamics and we needed to accommodate those. So I would say that, again, I like the estimations that were created by the Public Service Department because I know the care with which they were obtained. And I would put onto that some sort of language or a buffer or something to accommodate where there's likely going to be fluctuations over the course of time. And I would also say that I do believe that it could be much less expensive to have someone brought in to do the physical arrangements at the price much less than the state nuclear engineer, who I value immensely as someone who has toured the site with him numerous times to be able to look at highly technical issues that are occurring there. And it was a shame that we couldn't do more of that this afternoon because he had to come here and make sure that this meeting was set up. So I just wanted to make sure I covered everything in my notes here. And I think I have. Thank you very much.
So I guess I will bring it back to The question at this point in my mind, and I could be completely wet, but is what is the dollar figure that it takes to be able to effectively communicate to the public as handicap? And not necessarily how it's spent and who it's spent on and all that kind of thing, but what is the overall dollar figure of what makes our jobs viable to the public? And I don't know that we can answer that question this evening. I really don't. But that's what it boils down to, how the dollars get spent in the end, whether they're, because it has to be fluid, whether it be a specialist that we need 6 months from now, or whether it's a specialist that we need 2 weeks from now. In the end, it's a dollar figure. It's not necessarily how we spend it immediately. I don't think we can put forth a proposal that says, this is how we're going to spend all these dollars every single year going forward for the next 5 years, because as certain needs arise, we need to be able to flow those dollars to those needs, in my opinion. So I think a dollar figure needs to be reached, whether it be this evening or a different time. God, I hope it's this evening, because I don't want to do this again, honestly. But I think we have a very good start with what the Public Service Department has put in front of us, what Representative Sabiri and Coffey has put in front of us, to be able to determine that dollar figure. And again, everything falls back on you, Commissioner Tarrant, how those dollars get spent. So I think it behooves us to determine that dollar figure this evening, and your department from there determines whether it's Mr. Lashinsky's time to set up tables or whether it's somebody else's time to set up tables. That's not in the purview of the handicap panel. That's in your purview of how those dollars are spent. What we're trying to determine tonight as a panel is what do we need as a panel to be able to effectively communicate to the outside world that wants to participate in this process.
So I'm concerned about the notion of, I'm concerned about a few things. I think, I'm not sure if the commissioner was explicit, but I think the notion of putting together an MOU outside with North Star for the support of this panel, I don't think is something that she would support. We probably should hear from her as to whether or not it is.
That is correct. I would not support that.
Right. And so that then becomes the place where we get a little sticky in statute. And so if we put in a dollar amount in statute, that's just going to be, I mean, it's fine. We can do that. We can try that. I think that there will be, we have to figure out, is that a tax? Is that a fee? Are there other businesses that would be assessed that kind of tax or fee? So if we're trying to put something like that in statute, and so if we're just putting in place, we're just shifting who pays, that may be simpler. And although I think it still would have to go to, as Representative Coffey has said, it still would have to go to probably Ways and Means and Appropriations Committee. And I would expect, as I mentioned at the last hearing, that having that be an unlimited prospect in statute will probably get some resistance from North Star. And as we've heard the commissioner say this evening, it has been limited. It has been limited. It's not limited in statute, but right now it's limited by the state budget. So I would just offer that for consideration by the panel. Mr. Chair, I would note that we are a little over schedule. I hate to, just in case you wanted to
Could I make
hear from
Mr. Leach?
If you will put this forward as a motion, I will second it for you. Or would you like me to put it forward?
I think that it might behoove us to, you can certainly do whatever you'd like to do. I think it might behoove us to hear from members of the public who are actually here and who I suspect may have some things to say that may be helpful in this regard, may not be helpful, but they will be instructive.
Okay, so to that end, we are kind of over our time allotted for discussion from the panel on operating costs, potential funding options. So at this time, I will open up to public questions and input on the panel cost and funding options. Willing to hear from anybody from the public regarding that. It looks like you're being coerced. Come on up.
Good evening. I'm Chris Williams. I'm from Hancock. I work with Citizens Awareness Network, and I'm also with the Nuclear Information and Resource Service in Washington. I have a lot more questions than I had when I walked in the door. But after reviewing the materials earlier today, my thought was that perhaps the logistical costs could be assigned to Entergy, the non-controversial logistical costs.
It's North Star.
The department to provide funding for the expert staff time as well as outside experts if they become necessary. And somebody said it earlier, a lot's been said tonight. If you run into a cost overrun scenario where North Star might be saying one thing, it might be useful to have somebody to review what North Star is saying with regard to a particular cost overrun. Additionally, of course, if there are discoveries of both radiological or non-radiological contaminants on the site that are going to raise costs and have not been included in previous site characterizations, that might require an expert. But to take the non-controversial, just nuts and bolts costs of having the meetings and keeping the records properly, and sound, notice, and assign those to North Star if possible. And then look to the department for experts. That's what I would recommend. So I look forward to listening to the conversation tonight and ongoing, and hope that in the future there's less talk about money and more talk about what's going on the site. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional public comments?
Hi, I'm Ann Darling. I live in East Hampton, Massachusetts. Before I say anything else, I want to remind you that there is no one sitting on the panel from Massachusetts, and there should be, and I hope you'll make the governor of the state that I now live in do something about that. Thank you. I want to kind of echo what Emily was saying about what I would like to see the panel be a vector and a conduit to the public. And besides putting things on the website, basically what gets out to the public is left to whether or not there's someone here from the press and if people read that story. Or if I write a letter to the editor, which I did a couple weeks ago. So, and it's true that people, what you were saying, Mr. Unruh, about people are not as concerned because people don't feel as threatened as we used to, or scared. Thank goodness. But I do think that, and things seem to be going okay right now, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm very happy. But they might not in the future. And I think somebody also said it's important for you to have a way to communicate with the public beyond what's on the website. And that could even be regular postings in some of the major ways of communicating, not just in Brattleboro, but all around New Hampshire, Massachusetts, but beyond Vernon. It's wonderful that Vernon is very, very closely involved. You should be. I'm happy about that too. I'd like to see more people on this panel who are actual citizens, not representatives of, from outside of Vernon. It's good to have a lot of Vernon people. And I'd like to see maybe, a monthly piece in some local newspapers or some forums that could be put on BCTV and other cable channels. I think people need to know, and you said it yourself, Mr. Unruh, that it's your responsibility to keep people informed whether they're here or not. So how much you do of that is partially a question of money. But I want to hear a commitment from the panel that that's what the money will be used for. I really do.
Hi, good evening. I'm Clay Turnbull. I'm with New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution. I'm a staff person and a trustee. And I was glad to hear that a report that Ray Shadd has prepared sounds like it was distributed to the panel. I just wanted to highlight a couple of lines from it. North Star will pay itself approximately 38% of the decommissioning fund to administer decommissioning activities. And there's a modest 10% overrun cushion built into the budget. In addition, North Star anticipates an end-of-the-day surplus in excess of $20 million to be divided 55-45% between North Star and Vermont utilities. At Maine Yankee, we can get a rough idea of the kinds of monies that Maine Yankee spent on its cap by looking at a short list of the kinds of educative activities that Maine Yankee sponsored. The cap toward 2 sites deploying dry-fueled storage systems, at Calvert Cliffs Nuclear Power Plant in Maryland and Palisades in Michigan. The cap toward plants undergoing decommissioning, including Connecticut Yankee and Big Rock Point in Michigan. The CAP participated in American Nuclear Society decommissioning conferences in Michigan, Connecticut, and Nevada, which included an engineering tour of National Repository at Yucca Mountain. The CAP participated in meetings with counterpart advisory panels in Connecticut and Michigan. The CAP participated in an industry decommissioning conference in Florida and conferences in Washington, Middletown, Connecticut, where travel, lodging, and expenses and conference fees were involved. One should include in any back-of-the-envelope calculations the fact that the CAP averaged 14 to 15 members. This information provides not only a sense of scale, hundreds of thousands of dollars, not tens of thousands of dollars, but it also is hoped that a sense of purpose, that is, education without nuclear-related oversight, can only be arbitrary and vaguely effective. And lastly, Maine Yankee recognized at the onset that in order to communicate effectively, it needed to develop a commonly understood language about decommissioning, and this involved not only attentive and discerning listening to community stakeholders, but also offering them the opportunity to familiarize themselves with nuclear processes and regulation. I don't know where this panel, the line between this panel and the group that New England Coalition fought to get established as part of the MOU, where the line between them is. But to me, the education is a missing link. You know, that the company could be making more of an effort to provide some real education, whether it's to this panel or to the group that we're trying to fund. I think that the general public, there are people that want to understand the technical issues so that they can determine, so that they can say, okay, I'm not just taking someone else's word for it. And I'm, you know, Bob Leach, you've got an entire career of education that lots of folks would love to understand. So, thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I think we're at that place in the evening where we would be contemplating a break. And before we did that, I frankly am unsure of how to proceed here. I brought sufficient copies of a draft statutory amendment that I would be happy to distribute to folks so they can look at what my thoughts have been about what we might do. I have heard the conversation tonight about the $35,000 figure. I've heard Dr. Owen's comments about a higher figure. It occurs to me that this language that I've put together could be, again, modified to accommodate some sort of cap. I just don't know where and how to prompt that discussion. But I wanted you to make you aware of that as an option for tonight. I do have that material here if it would be of interest to the panel members.
I think that makes two of us that I'm not exactly sure where to go from here based on the discussion that we've had both from the public sector and from the panel itself. So I will say that we are going to go to a 5-minute break, and if you'd like to distribute those materials that you have during that 5-minute break, you are welcome to do so. We will reconvene this meeting at 7:35. So we are going to head to additional panel discussion on operating cost and funding options. So during the break, Commissioner Tierney put out a proposed amendment to 18 VSA 1700 G6, and I will allow Commissioner Tierney to speak towards that amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I alluded to earlier in the evening, I had this language has been prepared in order to effectuate the outcome that I would prefer, which was an amendment to 18 VSA 1700 G6, such that North Star bears the costs of hiring experts, contracting for services, and providing for materials and other reasonable and necessary expenses of the panel, as the commissioner, meaning me, may consider appropriate on the request of the panel from time to time. The idea is that by June 30th annually, the department would render a bill basically to North Star that details the amount of monies that have been expended on experts or the contract for services and the like. And in turn, North Star would then pay that bill within 30 days into the special fund that's been established per statute to support the Department of Public Service. It also supports the Public Utility Commission, but that's neither here nor there right now. The language clarifies that the monies so paid by North Star into the special fund would be paid solely to the department, meaning they would not be shared with the Public Utility Commission. And finally, the owners of the Vermont Yankee Station, North Star, would have the right to petition the Public Utility Commission to review and determine, after opportunity for hearing, the necessity and reasonableness of such expenses and may amend or revise such cost assessments is what I put in here, but expenses would be fine too. Based on the conversation tonight, it occurs to me that we could insert a cap in here if the panel thought that was appropriate. And if we did so, I would propose that it be in the second line that is underscored from the top, such that it would now read, the owners of the VYNPS as the Commissioner of Public Service may consider appropriate, comma, not to exceed. The number we've used tonight is 35,000 or whatever other number this panel settles on. And 35,000 would be would reflect what Representative Sibilia and Representative Coffey came up with through their research. To be clear again, I have circulated a statement of costs for the panel to date, principally to raise awareness of what costs are invested so far in the operations of this panel, for better or for worse. The Section 1 costs are those logistical costs that I think North Star ought to bear. The Section 2 costs are the PSD staff time that supports NDCAP. I'm not proposing that that be included in this amendment to Section 6G. I just wanted the panel to be aware that these costs are being incurred. And then the costs on Section 3 having to do with the agency participation, I think it would be fair to put that in, but not necessary. Certainly any per diem increase, as suggested by Representative Sibilia and Representative Coffey, would be something that would be fair to include under that $35,000. I do agree with Mr. Unruh that there's no need to specify what the $35,000 is expended on, because with the way I've put the language into the statute, I think it's pretty clear that it is supposed to go, the $35,000 would go toward hiring experts, contracting for services, and providing materials, and other reasonable necessary expenses of the panel. So the Section 2 costs and Section 3 costs are not costs that I regard as fitting into that or being included in that language. Are there questions from the panel?
Go ahead, Laura.
So I have a couple of questions. When would this end?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and that's something that I was just discussing with counsel for North Star. It's a very logical question to be asking, but interestingly, it prompts a larger existential question for this panel. If you'll note, as we sit here tonight, NDCAP has no shelf life. So I don't think that it would be necessary for us to put an end date on here. I can certainly understand if there are folks who feel a need for that, but what you're really raising is the larger question of how long should NDCAP exist? I would say this would go on for however long NDCAP exists.
So I would suggest a termination of, at the time that partial license termination happens. Because at the time, I feel that NDCAP no longer has a value. I hate to say that, but it no longer has a substantial value, I guess, after the partial license termination.
Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
If I may add one point to that, there's also the site restoration part of this process that is exclusive to the Public Utility Commission jurisdiction. And it would seem to me that if there's going to be a termination date, that it should also include that. So it's not just partial license termination by the NRC, but also when site restoration has been achieved to the satisfaction of the Public Utility Commission, in my opinion.
Go ahead, Chris.
Just briefly, I would agree with that. And another thing that, and not to draw out the conversation, I think it's something that could be figured out later on, but I believe, and Clay, maybe you know, or maybe the folk with North Star know, I think both the Yankee Row cap and the main Yankee cap still meet once a year or have some kind of annual something. And so those continue to exist. Now, I'm not saying whether or not it should, but it'd be worth talking to those communities about, is there utility once it's just the ISFC left on the site, is there value? And maybe that's not the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel, maybe that's something else, but just wanted to put that out there.
Commissioner, how would you envision the panel accessing funds? So you've spoken to the fact that we've had a push down because there haven't been funds available from the department. So would you see that changing with this language, with this cap in there? And how would you envision the panel doing that?
Yeah, no, those are also really good questions. And so, yes, if the funds were available and they were the responsibility of the company, I would expect them to then be available to this panel. The mechanism that presently exists is that at the end of the day, the panel makes its request to the commissioner for funds for these activities. That's the existing statute. And I use my best judgment as to whether to make those funds available. And what I have proposed here is that would continue. That mechanism would continue.
And so experts have, again, that has not been something that's been available.
Precisely. And that's the genesis of my concern, is that they've not been available. Not only has, well, Chris will speak to this in a moment, I think, but I will loosely say, to date, on my watch, none have been requested beyond what Chris asked for in the sale docket, or it's a backstory I'm happy to go into, but the bottom line is we've not had any such requests, but I think it's fair to say that I have sent every signal possible saying there's no point in making a request because I don't have money. And that's just not good enough, in my opinion, which is why I've been so concerned about this issue.
And I'm hearing that that might remain the same.
It's entirely possible.
Because the cost, the $35,000 is...
If we wanted to take that out of my budget today, that's a non-starter.
Because $35,000 is more than what you are putting forth your agency spends on handicap right now.
That would be additional to what I already put in, that's correct.
So it would not cover what you're currently expending.
And I'm not asking to, what I'm looking for is for the company to be responsible for that $4,000 plus for the logistics, and then for whatever is left under this cap, that would be what's available to this panel for hiring experts and contracting for services. For instance, Chris mentioned not too long ago that there was a consensus-seeking process, I think, that my predecessor conducted. You and Dr. Owen might know about this, or Corey, I don't know if you do too. Yeah. Judging by these figures, the cost of that, there doesn't appear to be a record of it at the department. But it's that kind of facilitation process, for instance, or educational initiatives or the like. Those are things that open up if there's money available to be charged to the company.
Can I mention just one brief thing that may have to provide a little context too, which is when IndyCap was first started, and actually in docket and Public Utility Commission dockets before that, there was a concern about like when IndyCap was first created, it was envisioned that decommissioning wouldn't start for 60 years or so, and so there was real concern about the company funding that because it would be coming out of the decommissioning trust, which would then decrease the amount of funds available for decommissioning. So now we have a more discrete timeline, but I would say that it would be just in case anybody has any concerns about suddenly, if North Star is bearing the bill, that suddenly folk are going to go crazy and want to spend all kinds of money. Well, we all have a vested interest in being very, very thoughtful about how those funds are used, because I think it's still coming out of the decommissioning trust. I think that'd be the likely source of funds, because that's the source of funds they have to use. So I don't know that that's exactly the case, but just in case folk remember those old arguments from back in the day about concerns about where the funding for a panel would come from. Now at least we know approximately how many years we're looking at and what kind of budget we're probably looking at.
So I have additional questions. Looking at the final line here, I'm not sure that it may be a typo or maybe a punctuation issue. The owners of Vermont Yankee may petition the Public Utility Commission to review and determine, after opportunity for a hearing, the necessity and reasonableness of such expenses, and may amend or revise such cost assessments. So is that intended to be that the owners of Vermont Yankee may amend or revise such cost assessments?
No, it's for the Public Utility Commission. And
So I read that as...
Yep, I can see why you read it that way. We could simply put a period after such expenses and say the Public Utility Commission may amend or revise such cost assessments.
Mr. Chair, I have two other questions, if I may continue.
Go ahead.
So, Chris, or does anybody recall, my sense is this language for handicap was likely drafted as part of the original settlement between the state and Entergy, 2013-14.
I want to say it was 12. No, but there must have been 13. Must have been the winter of 13.
It was not part of the settlement.
No, but no, it was not part of the settlement, no, but it was, but I think it came out of the settlement concept. I mean,
It was a
I think
logical...
it was not in the settlement, but it was...
It was intended to be a successor to VSNAP, which had its own issues.
So my question, larger question is around, I'm guessing that there was probably some negotiation between the advocates and the company and the government.
I can't speak to that.
No.
I just know Mr.
Can
Campney
anybody
has strong
speak to that?
feelings.
No? Does anybody recall that? And then, I guess...
It was done quickly.
Yeah. And then my last question, and I don't know if this is appropriate or they'll be willing to do so, but does North Star want to weigh in on this at this point?
Do we have panel members here?
I'll open it up to North Star members on the panel and or North Star Council.
Sure. David Pearson.
No.
So, well, looks like Mr. DiCarlo's going to step up, so we're going to hand it over to council.
Rick DiCarlo, North Star Council. I think this is a potentially workable solution, but we'll have to internally confer and report back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, I think my final comment would be one that I had suggested to you earlier. If there is consensus on the panel or some place on the panel, and the intention is to try and move this year, I would hope that there would be some consensus on the panel and that the panel itself would engage with the commissioner in moving this legislation forward.
Sure. So kind of let me recap everything that we've been discussing since we received this proposed amendment. From what I'm understanding, as a consensus of the panel, please correct me if I'm wrong, I will start at looks like the second sentence of the proposed amendment. Funds for this purpose shall come from the owners of the VYNPS, as the Commissioner of Public Service may consider appropriate not to exceed $35,000 annually and to terminate at the time of partial license terminations and site restoration is complete. That kind of seems like the general consensus of the board that $35,000 dollar number is acceptable, and that it is to terminate at the end of partial license termination and site restoration. And then at the bottom of that amendment, there add a period as of reasonableness of such expenses, period. The Public Utility Commission may amend or revise such cost assessments. Now, I'm looking for a consensus on those particular terms of this amendment, please. Go ahead, sir.
Chair, I just had a question of the commissioner before getting to your amendment, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just for clarification, Commissioner, you're saying that this fund, if this funding were to become available, it would not go to pay for the costs of Department of Public Service staff?
That's correct.
So I'm wondering, so in effect, it does bring greater capacity and to this work that we're doing here, so which I think is a very good thing. And I'm wondering if we can clarify some of the language, because I also heard that there were a couple of things that the public, or if we could add a word like public engagement education in there, to the list of things that could be considered, so as to expand upon the possibilities that currently exist.
So you're talking, let's look at the 1, 2, 3, fourth line down in the underlined portion.
Right, so.
Service to hire experts, comma.
Contract for services, comma, and provide for materials and other reasonable and necessary expenses for the panel. If the rest of this panel were to agree, I just think it would be good to add some language around, because we've been talking about whether it's attending a conference or doing some broader public engagement in some way, right? I've heard that tonight. So I'm not always the best at wordsmithing.
Okay, so service to hire experts, public engagement and education, contract for services, and provided materials and other, would that be satisfactory?
I'd like some specificity. Contract for services, cover expenses associated with public engagement or and education. I mean,
May I ask as a point of clarification? I understand what you're driving at, Representative Coffey. In my opinion, that would constitute a reasonable or necessary expense if the panel decides that's what it wants to do, and the commissioner decides it's appropriate. Is it your concern that you'd like to have it specified such that it's removed from the discretion of the commissioner? And it's okay to say yes, I won't be offended.
It's mostly more about the intention of adding this in here to just reflect that. So I don't want to belabor the point. And so my second point is to follow up on the chair's comment about how long this funding would last. If we look at the full statute, I think I would prefer something simpler that said that this would not to exceed $35,000 annually for as long as the handicap or the panel exists. Because I don't think it should be linked to what we think the process is going to be. The rest of the statute doesn't do that.
Yeah.
So my 2 cents.
So let's tackle that portion of it, because the public engagement and education is easy enough to add into that wording. Let's look at the termination of this actual agreement, what the panel feels is necessary. I mean, we can feel it's necessary that we exist for the rest of our lives and get, involvement in this as long as the spent fuel sits on the ISFSI pad, which, if that's what the panel wants to do, that's what the panel wants to do. But at that point, North Star is no longer, in my estimation, is no longer on the site, no longer responsible for the site, because they probably turned it over at that point to some other entity. So how do we, as a panel, charge a company that's no longer in existence in the state of Vermont to fund a panel that we decide, we're just gonna continue this because we have this money. Because we still have spent fuel on the pad. That would be my only concern. It seems to be fairly open-ended in that respect.
Mr. Chair, if I may. I appreciate the sentiment that you're expressing. I really do. This has been an exercise in people of good faith trying to set reasonable expectations and reasonable limits. My memory and others on the panel and in the end counsel to the agency may be able to correct me, is that North Star has acquired this site. So when decommissioning is complete, they don't simply turn it over to somebody else. It is their property. They may not have boots on the ground anymore doing decommissioning activity, but they do still own it. So I take your point, though, that we really are getting at the existential question of how long do we expect handicap to continue to exist. And the legislature, at least in prior iterations of this statute, has not specified an end date. I suppose I have sympathy for the simplicity that Representative Coffey has pointed to. But I suppose we could add some, I don't know, I would defer to my legislative colleagues. Is there sunset language that could be put in, or I really don't know.
I guess to your point, Commissioner Tierney, yes, they will still own the property after decommissioning is done, termination of the license, partial termination of the licensing, and site restoration happens. But what is it to say that, they don't turn the property over to a developer, to the town of Vernon, whatever the case may be, and at that point, whomever that is, the developer, the town of Vernon, Wyndham Regional Commission, BDCC now owns the property, and we are continuing to ask North Star to fund a panel when they have no skin in the game at that point.
Well,
Just because we want to continue a panel because we still have radioactive material that sits on the ISFSI, but maybe they're out of the game at that point.
I take your point, though. I would note the language points to the owners of the station.
So that could potentially, this $35,000 could potentially become the problem of
whoever acquires the site, that's correct.
Yeah, the town of Vernon as an example.
And that's a problem. I completely see your point.
Yeah.
I think Chris had a question.
Well, I was just going to...
Which I will clarify, because there was mention from the public that as of yesterday, I have no tie to the town of Vernon. I am no longer a selectman in the town of Vernon. I have no, there is no tie for the town of Vernon with me any longer, with the exception of maintaining the office of Deputy Emergency Administrator. So I am not, I'm speaking in generalized terms at this point.
So I was just going to say, I'm looking at, I don't have the enabling statute in front of me, but I've got the our charter in front of me. And handicap, says, I think this is parrots the language, handicap shall advise the Governor, General Assembly, and agencies of the state on issues related to decommissioning. That's nuclear. Now, I mean, I would like to see it go through site restoration too, but you could logically say handicap would sunset upon the completion of decommissioning, and then maybe leave an escape clause like this could be reconsidered by the legislature at that time, but that may be the language that you use because that's the actual purpose of the, I mean, it's imperfect to me, and I would defer to the rest of the panel because it seems like it'd be worthwhile for, to have the panel in existence for the completion of the non-radiological decommissioning as well. And maybe that's, and I'd have to look into in detail at the enabling statute because maybe it talks about non-radiological. Does it? But anyway, I can, but that may be an approach to take, just reflecting on what it says. What I am just forgetting, I'm not remembering from the last meeting. Are we supposed to meet again soon, or is this?
God, I hope not.
So I'm almost wondering if we agree in concept with what the commissioners put forth, and if we've heard from North Star that this seems within the realm of possibility of something they would consider, and you'll take it back to your internal counsel, what if, and what if the Public Service Department, North Star had a conversation, come up with some mutually agreeable language, we wouldn't have to meet but get it back to the panel, but then frankly, the individual panel members could always go testify.
Sure. I guess to Representative Sebelia's point is that we need to come to a general consensus as a panel tonight on the dollar figure, a termination date if we so desire, and then I think your point is well taken, that allow the powers that be go forth in making the agreement based on our suggestions. I guess I'll start with one particular item. Does look for a consensus of the panel of $35,000. Does that seem to be a good start, or the place where we need to be to continue to grow from here as the handicap and get the things that we need to get done? So I'm going to ask for a consensus on that particular section. It is the $35,000 that was, brought forth to us by Representative Sebelia and Coffey, acceptable to the panel as part of the amendment to 18 VSA 1700 G6. But
So, can you ask those questions? I think the frame that Chris has, like if that's a goal, is for North Star and the department to see if there is something they can agree to with the items that you're asking for consensus. Is that what we're doing, Mr. Chair?
yes,
Okay.
that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay, so,
May I ask for clarification on this, though?
Yes.
I have tried very hard to avoid being in that very position of it being North Star and department. Go work it out. That's exactly why I prepared this language tonight, so that this panel can decide whether it wants to move forward on this basis or some other basis. If we get consensus on the $35,000, that's a very clear instruction. If we can get consensus on end date being when the handicap, for as long as handicap exists, appreciating there are members on the panel who don't necessarily support that, but if we can get consensus on that, that's clear direction. If we can get consensus on the public engagement piece, that's clear direction. And then I can speak for myself and say that I'm happy to take this amendment, if need be, to the legislature, or our legislative colleagues could put this in if they're willing or not. But I don't see what my speaking with North Star is going to add to this. North Star can certainly testify in the legislature as it sees fit. And I have high hopes that, based on council's comments tonight, that testimony would be largely supportive, but I would leave that to you. I think that distance is healthy, in my opinion.
So I guess that's my goal, is to hit those three things: the dollar figure, determination, the language of public engagement, get a consensus on those things. And I think what Representative Sebelia was kind of aiming at is that we come to an agreement on how that wording happens between your department and North Star. So the clear direction from the panel for dollar figure, for termination, for how public engagement should happen, and then you guys figure out the legalese between yourselves, because that's not our expertise as panel members, is to make those.
That's the part that's making me uncomfortable.
Okay. I would love to be able to give you all the legalese to make this thing work, but I don't know. Mr. Irwin, you had a question, comment?
Just on the notion of the possibility that another property owner would be potentially saddled with the responsibility for funding the handicap. I wonder if changing the language from owners of the VYNPS to owners of the VYNPS license or licenses would help in that regard, because it's either going to be the license for the ISFAC and the plant in decommissioning, which are two different parts of the Code of Federal Regulations, or it'll be just the ISFAC because the other part of the plant would have been fully decommissioned, license termination would have been completed.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure about anybody else. Go ahead.
I'd like to, correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, and the license won't really be terminated. What will happen is once North Star has finished the decommissioning and reduced all the contamination to appropriate levels, the property will be released for unconditional use. They would still have the license for the IFAC, but the rest of the property would be released for unconditional use. Am I out of turn there, Corey, or is that pretty close?
That's very close. The Part 50 license will sustain until the ISFAC is finally decommissioned. It's all the same license. But the general terms for which you're describing, I'm sure language could be developed that would satisfy what we're talking about.
And I think that's Mr. Irwin's intent, is that whomever the property goes to, that the onus still stays on North Star as a licensee of the ISFAC or whatever, still exists. Is that correct, Mr. Irwin?
Yes, that is correct. The license is really the key to the problem.
All right.
Mr. Chair, I've had a suggestion from my council, the wonders of technology. If we had a three-way involvement here where Ledge Council were involved as well in these discussions, that would make the department more comfortable, so that the legalese piece that you're talking about would be worked out between Ledge Council, North Star, and the department. That gives me some comfort.
And I'm completely okay with that. So let me circle back to where I started.
Sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine. We're working through it. So as a panel, I would like to get a consensus on the dollar figure of $35,000 annually is acceptable to us to be able to move our work forward. And just give me a yes or no. Please start with you, Chris.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Abstain.
Abstain.
On the phone?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we have a majority in agreements on the dollar figure of $35,000 annually. Let's go to the easy part, the public engagement side of it. So adding the language, again, fourth line down in the underline, service to hire experts, public engagement and education, contracts for services and provide materials and other reasonable and necessary expenses of the panel. Noting that obviously this is how the money gets spent is completely up to the public service department. Adding simple language such as in public engagement and education. Is everyone happy with that, or general consensus? Chris?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Abstain.
Abstain.
Okay. So we have that. Oh yeah, sorry, on the phone?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So you have a majority agreement adding simple language regarding public engagement and education to the list of things that will become necessary of the panel. So to the hard thing, termination. We heard a couple of different options. regarding the owners of the VY NPS license or licenses is an option for us. That seems to make the most sense to me at this point. So let's get a general consensus of, does that make the most sense as a termination, standard?
You can say that.
So, let's see, funds for the purpose shall come from the owners of the VYNPS license holder. Is that correct, Mr. Irwin?
Yes, and I've been corrected by Corey that it is just one license,
Yeah.
so it doesn't have to consider multiple licenses.
So that would be the termination, the terminology used in that first sentence. So whomever is the license holder for the property is responsible for going forward.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
may I interrupt our process?
Yes.
So I need a moment to actually process the negotiation aspect that has been put out here. And it seems that we're going to do all of that like very publicly. So I'm wondering if we could get the department's counsel to come and we could ask maybe some questions just about process.
I guess I'm confused. What are you looking
The
for a
department
process
is
on?
recommending that, the department council is recommending that rather than having North Star and the department go and kind of fine tune this and bring it to the legislature, that the legislature and the administration and North Star fine tune this. And so I'd just like to ask him to clarify and kind of walk us through that a little bit. Because I've had no time to think about that or ask legislative counsel or anyone. So, and I'm getting, like we're kind of almost at the bottom of the slide and I'm feeling like, oh, we're going to catch this. Do we want to catch this? So, can we ask?
I'm certainly happy to ask Mr. Porter to step to the microphone, if that's all right with you, Mr. Unruh.
Absolutely. Come on up.
Thank you. Jim?
Almost made it out of here cleanly.
Yeah. Well, and I have to pick up a soccer kid.
Okay.
I have to leave in 20 minutes at the most. My question is, I want to understand the difference that you see between the department and North Star fine-tuning this, and the department and the legislature and North Star fine-tuning this, and what assurances you'd like to give me that Ledge Council will see those same.
So what was in my mind when this came up was the commissioner seemed to have some reservations about the department and North Star going off in a room and drafting the consensus of what you vote on tonight. And I guess my thought would be to have a lawyer from Ledge Council, since we are talking about a bill or a bill amendment. And we've done this in the past with other parties, just sit down with Ledge Council sort of as an intermediary, another party to be there. And, we could just both talk with them, was my thought.
Okay, but I want to just make sure that we're all aware that whatever agreement we might put forward, we'll have to go through the whole legislative process. Any of the folks in the audience, in the public, anybody in the legislature that would like can engage in this process. And any legislator can access Ledge Council and, work to.
Oh, right, and to be clear, I was only going as far as coming up with a draft of a bill that we would submit to the committee. And frequently, Ledge Council has little fixes that help with drafting as well. Just that I think we would then come back and share with the committee, not necessarily at a meeting, but.
Okay, great. That answers my questions, and I am comfortable now. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go back to the,
Mr. Chair,
Oh.
it appears North Star's council may have something to say.
absolutely, come on up.
Thank you, Greg DiCarlo, Counsel for North Star. I just want to clarify that my earlier comments were premised on termination at partial license termination, not later. Any questions about that?
You're aware that's not, there's no such thing as a partial license termination. It's a release of property for unconditional use. It's semantics, but words are kind of important sometimes.
It's the shrinking of the license from its current size down to the ISFC only is what I'm referring to. We can work on the proper language, but that's what we're looking at as a potential workable solution.
If I could be heard on that point.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
I think we've gotten to the place where the committee itself has to decide what it wants to do. And then that conversation that Mr. DiCarlo is teeing up is one worth having, and exactly why I would want the antiseptic of Ledge Council being present. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about a piece of legislation that we will put into the hopper of the committee process. And at that time, I would expect North Star to, if we can't come to closure on the point, you show up and testify to that effect. But that shouldn't foreclose this committee from deciding tonight on what it wants to put forward by way of proposal. And I expect, I could be wrong, that we're going to need to have 2 consensus votes. One's going to be on this termination that's tied to license termination and site restoration, and the other to the proposal from Representative Coffey that the obligation simply be coextensive with as long as NDCAP exists.
Okay, I'm gonna abstain from weighing in on this last piece because I don't feel like I have enough information.
So I guess, Chris, there's a couple different options on the table right now, and I'm just going to be looking for the board, and obviously, feel free to abstain if you feel the same as Representative Sibilia, that you don't have the proper information to make a decision. So we have essentially 2 different proposals on the table as far as timeline goes. One from Mr. Irwin about license holders, and that, this is kind of perpetual to license holders to the end of NDCAP, and 2, to the partial license termination and restoration would be the second option to put an end to this particular agreement. So I guess I'm looking to you to see which one you're leaning towards to get a general consensus from the NDCAP panel. So we'll start with you.
So I have to start with a question. Because what I had originally thought was terminate NDCAP upon the, because just looking at at some level I'd like to change the statute to say site restoration. It's actually in our name because I was trying to figure out, was the intent of the statute nuclear decommissioning versus decommissioning and site restoration, but it's actually in our name, the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. So what I was proposing was that the NDCAP would sunset with the completion of the nuclear decommissioning, which I think goes back to what you were saying, is basically the license is the partial release, and then all that's left is the ISFC. And then I'd also suggested potential language would be at that point the legislature could take up whether or not to continue, NDCAP should continue once it's just the ISFC on the site. I know that sounds real complicated, but I think what I was, and I'm kind of looking down at Bill to see what he would suggest, because he's more of actually the expert on this question.
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert for sure, that would be debatable, but the language that is in the 2-page presentation by Representative Sibilia and Coffey, number 3, time horizon of North Star funding obligation, the language that's described here, where does that come from? Is that in NRC regulations? Because as Mr. DiCarlo just explained it, actually that is what I was describing. It does not eliminate the burden on the license holder of the ISVC. It just has narrowed it down to release of the rest of the site for the decommissioning purposes, which is everything but the ISVC. So I'm actually more comfortable with the original language as presented in the item number 3, time horizon and North Star funding obligation, than I was when this discussion started.
May I ask a clarifying point, Mr. Unruh?
Yes.
So, Dr. Irwin, if I understand you correctly, if we were to insert the phrase North Star's funding obligation to support handicap activities shall terminate upon North Star's submission to the NRC of its partial license termination application, that would make you comfortable?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I'd put that out for comment to the rest of the panel. I could agree to that too. I would be comfortable with that too.
Okay. Chris, you good with that? Yes. Laura, you're abstaining, or are you good?
No, I mean, that's clear enough.
Okay. Sarah?
Yep.
Yes?
Yep.
Paul?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Commissioner?
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yes.
Yep. North Star representatives?
Abstain.
Abstain.
On the phone?
I'm good with that.
Yes.
Okay. We now have a clear directive from this panel to the Public Service Department, and from my understanding is that we are looking for the Public Service Department, the Ledge Council, and North Star Council to get together and make the legalese work. Is that my understanding, panel? Chris?
Yes, and then the idea, I think, is we wouldn't meet to discuss it again, but whatever's negotiated would come back to the panel so that we can, individually if we like, or whatever, or however we want to communicate it individually, communicate that to committee.
May I ask how exactly that is done? I'm hearing no further meeting, but come back to panel.
I just meant like Tony would send us, this is the language they agreed to.
And each individual, so there would be no hit return all.
Unless folk want to meet again, I just don't know that we're gonna, I don't know that this panel is the best way, and I'm also being mindful of the public input, so the public needs to see what it says too. I just don't know that we're gonna need to be in the business of wordsmithing legislative language. So I think what we're agreeing to is the concept that's been presented here, so we're agreeing to the concept, and then the answer frankly may come back, hey, Public Service Department, in a meeting with North Star, with Ledge Council present, we couldn't come to an agreement, but at least we know that we agreed to the concept that was presented by the commissioner.
So are you looking for, once the wording is acceptable to our parties, what are you looking for the handicap to do, in your opinion, from there?
Well, I'd like to be clear what handicap would like to have happen if North Star and the department don't come to an agreement.
Then we start all over again.
So, well, that's, so that.
Agreed to this concept that was handed out
So,
by the commissioner.
that's right. So that's an option. So one option is the commissioner handed out language. We've made a number of different suggestions. And what I'm hearing is North Star come back with any fine tunes with the department and work with the legislative council to work that through. So North Star may come back and say, yeah, no, we're not agreeing to that.
So let's get a little bit of clarification right now why we can, and I understand, Mr. Carlo, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and ask, based on what the handicap panel has put forth tonight, what is the general consensus? I know you probably can't give us a clear yes because you need to do your due diligence on your end, but based on what the panel has put forward this evening and kind of the limitations and that kind of thing, what is your general feeling of how North Star will react to a negotiation in that, towards that end?
Well, you're correct that I can't make a final determination tonight because it's ultimately not up to me, but I am very encouraged by what I heard as the end result of the panel's decision, that we will be able to come to an agreement quickly. If in fact what has been discussed here is what ends up in this final draft.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, just to clarify, I'm not asking, I'm not asking for North Star's permission to proceed, but whether or not the panel would want to proceed or would want to meet again if there was some conflict. That's what I'm asking.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, I have great faith in the efforts of these three bodies that we've identified here to act on our behalf, given the goals as expressed here tonight. So I don't think that it would be necessary for us to go beyond our individual rights to go to the hearings about this matter and discuss them as individuals or as representatives of agencies in the legislative process. I think that we've made our position known fairly clearly, and I appreciate the language, the efforts that everyone's made here to provide us this really good basis to make these kinds of recommendations.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, may I? Representative Sibilia, I know we're about to lose you because you're turning into a pumpkin. And Representative Coffey, what is your best estimation as to the time remaining for what we need to accomplish? If the department is able to sit down with a representative of North Star and Ledge Council, say within the week, and if the department is then able to kick back to the members of the panel individually the revised version of the language I've passed out tonight, and if that is posted on the website of the department for public comment for an acceptable period of time, a week perhaps, do you think that is sufficient, that there is still sufficient time to have this then go through the legislative process this session?
So the bill will have to, as you know, it will have to go through crossover. So it'll have to be heard in the House. Crossover will be the week after town meeting. And then it will have to go to the Senate.
Yeah.
And then it will have to, if there are any changes made in the Senate, it'll have to come back to the House. The House would have to agree or not, all of that. And then the governor would need to sign. So in terms of moving it through the House, it would have to move through the House by the week after town meeting. So the chair of the Energy and Technology Committee has been kept apprised by Representative Coffey and I of what is being discussed and the possibility for this coming through. It is true, we have some very significant pieces of legislation, so
So if the proposition is, what I am stumbling over the mechanics here more than anything else. If we are able to reach the latest greatest version of this proposed language and get that back to the individual handicap members for their review, and to do so electronically, do we run afoul of any open meeting laws or anything like that? And so if Mr. Unruh gets sign off from all the handicapped members in a manner that is lawful, then, and in the interim, the department has posted this for public comment on the website, it would seem to me we should be able to get this into the legislature in fairly short order.
Just for clarification, I don't think it's necessary for the handicap individual members to sign off on anything in particular. Okay.
That helps me. Yeah, that's what I'm asking basically.
But I think we've all expressed our opinion, and to Mr. Irwin's point, you know, if we wanted to pursue it individually, we have that option.
As long as it's clear that the representation that will be made in the legislature is that this final version, subject to the guidance you've been given, is the will of NDCAP.
And I think I feel that we've done that tonight in a public manner.
And I'm certain the minutes will be.
Reflect as
Will
much.
be, yeah, helpful. And in terms of public notice, Commissioner, I mean, the public can engage on this legislation. It's hanging on the wall right now.
Fair enough.
So we have the bill that is up on the wall in energy and technology now. What we'll be doing is making changes to that.
Okay.
And-
So what I'm taking away from this is that the department has a mandate to proceed from NDCAP, meeting with North Star and Ledge Council to get the final version of this and get this thing rolling. Fair enough.
That's my feeling as well.
Okay. I feel I'm moved by the spirit to comment that I feel this has been a very productive meeting tonight, and I thank my colleagues for their patience and persistence.
Absolutely. Do we have any additional input from the panel before I turn it over to the general public?
Did we agree to this in concept?
We should probably do it formally before Representative Sibilia turns into a
Because the other ones
pumpkin.
we've gone through, you've got the yes, 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 you want the yes on this, what the commissioner gave us?
Sure, with revisions, absolutely.
So I would agree that yes, supporting the concept presented here by the commissioner.
With the revisions that were made?
Yes.
Okay.
Is there others?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
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 Okay, great. All right, so we have a direction, we have a means to an end, and I will open it up to general public comment to the panel. Seeing none, we are adjourned.